This is the big one. GB News can confirm that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has relocated to a property on the Sandringham Estate belonging to His Majesty.
Breaking news shook the royal world this morning. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has officially been kicked out of Royal Lodge by his brother, King Charles III. After decades inside a 30-room estate, paying next to nothing, the disgraced Duke slipped away under cover of night. No cameras, no farewells, no trace. What looked like a quiet move has now become a royal turning point. Because this time, tradition stopped working. The rules shifted, and silence screamed louder than any royal statement ever could. Everything that followed would expose just how far the fall truly went. How did a single relocation turn into a test of acceptance and a new chapter in royal exile? The night of February 2nd, 2026 will be remembered not for pomp or protocol, but for one thing: disappearance. There were no announcements, no photos, no palace optics, just a shadow slipping out of Royal Lodge, the sprawling Windsor Great Park mansion that had been his home for over 20 years. The timing wasn't random, it was tactical. Palace insiders later confirmed that leaving in daylight wasn't an option. The humiliation, one aide reportedly said, would have been unbearable. For decades, Royal Lodge stood as Andrew's illusion of stability. 30 rooms across nearly 100 acres, secured through a controversial lease that became a public scandal years later. Even as his reputation imploded, he clung to the property like a lifeline. According to reports, the original plan was to hold out until Easter, but that plan shattered almost overnight. The pressure had been simmering behind the palace gates, and by early February, it finally erupted. A new release of Epstein-related court documents reignited scrutiny and forced Buckingham Palace's hand. In one resurfaced clip, Andrew defended himself awkwardly, saying,
Some breaking news this morning. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has been kicked out of the Royal Lodge by his brother, the King.
I've never really felt the need to go and party, and certainly going to, Giuffre's was not about partying. Absolutely not. Though he's long denied all allegations, the new wave of headlines made one truth unavoidable: his position at Royal Lodge had become untenable. The quiet exit that followed was both planned and pitiful. The move happened in total secrecy. Lights dimmed, staff minimized, vehicles shifted in silence. No waves to neighbors, no farewells, no final glance back. The symbolism was crushing. The man who once walked red carpets, who represented Britain on the world stage, who shook hands with presidents and generals, was now reduced to slipping away under cover of darkness. He wasn't just leaving a house. He was leaving behind an entire identity. His destination? Wood Farm Cottage, a small property tucked deep within the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, the same secluded retreat where his late father, Prince Philip, spent his last peaceful years. To the public, it sounded like a graceful retreat, modest, private, dignified. But to those inside the royal circle, the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't relocation, it was removal. Before Andrew even arrived, the whispers had begun. Aides described the mood as funereal. The move wasn't voluntary, it was survival. This was no longer a royal rearrangement, it was an evacuation. The final consequence of choices that could no longer be buried under protocol or privilege. As the iron gates of Royal Lodge clanged shut behind him, they closed more than an era. They closed the chapter of a prince who had outlived his royal grace. His retreat to Sandringham wasn't just a change of address. It was a quiet exile, wrapped in formality, marked by silence, and sealed by consequence.
Going to Giuffre's was not about partying. Absolutely.
And as dawn broke over Windsor the next morning, one question echoed through the palace halls. Was this the end of Prince Andrew's public existence, or the beginning of something even darker? Wood Farm was supposed to be a refuge, a place of quiet reflection, far from the cameras and the chaos. Instead, it became the setting that revealed just how far Prince Andrew's royal world had collapsed. What was meant to offer calm and distance turned into proof that his position inside the family had changed beyond recognition. So, what exactly happened behind those guarded gates at Sandringham that made Andrew finally feel the shift? What quiet decision cut deeper than any public humiliation? Stay with us, because this is the moment the rules of royal life were rewritten. When Andrew arrived at Wood Farm, there was no confrontation, no raised voices, no scene. Instead, something far colder awaited him, a policy, not a punishment. staff across the Sandringham Estate had received new instructions before his arrival. They were not obligated to serve him if they felt uncomfortable doing so. The choice was theirs. And according to multiple reports, several had already decided to step back. No rebellion, no drama, just a silent refusal to pretend. It wasn't defiance, it was procedure. The message came quietly from above, approved at the highest level. Service to Andrew is not mandatory. That was the moment everything shifted. For a man born into a world where deference was guaranteed, this rule was devastating. Inside the royal system, hierarchy is sacred. Staff serve the crown, but their daily loyalty flows through the royals they attend. For decades, Andrew had lived inside that comfort, surrounded by people whose duty was automatic, unspoken, and absolute. Now, that safety net was gone.
Royal staff are refusing to work for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor following his move to Sandringham. There are new allegations about the sordid and degrading acts the King's brother and his billionaire criminal friend.
The palace had rewritten the unthinkable. They had made respect optional. One Sandringham insider described it bluntly. There was already quite a list of people who didn't want to work for him. Not out of anger, just unease. And that's what made the moment historic. Because in the monarchy, dignity isn't stripped through announcements. It disappears quietly, through permission. Staff don't have to turn their backs to make a statement. Simply choosing not to show up says everything. Titles can be removed on paper, residences can be reassigned. But when the people behind the scenes, the butlers, the cooks, the attendants, are told they don't have to serve you, the collapse isn't symbolic anymore. It's real. For Andrew, this was a reality check sharper than Exile. At Royal Lodge, he'd still enjoyed protocol and routine. At Sandringham, those invisible protections vanished. No entourage, no personal aides, no wall of formality to hide behind. His rank no longer carried obligation. It now depended on consent. And that distinction mattered more than anything. The wording of the directive was careful. Staff weren't ordered to refuse service. They were told they could refuse if they wished. That subtle phrasing shifted responsibility from the institution to individual conscience. It was the palace's quiet way of saying, "You're on your own." It was the first time in modern royal history that a prince had to live under a rule designed not for protocol, but for boundaries. The silence that followed at Wood Farm spoke louder than outrage. For the first time, Andrew was not insulated by hierarchy or routine. His comfort, once guaranteed, now depended on the personal choice of others. And that, in royal terms, is a downfall no title can disguise.
Andrew wasn't benefiting the public goods because he wasn't paying any rent on it. In fact, he was paying peppercorn rent. And of course, on top of that, he was being accused by Virginia Giuffre, for example, the 17-year-old, or at the time was 17, accused Andrew of having sex with her.
What came next would only deepen that isolation. Because while Andrew adjusted to life under this new quiet exile, the palace had already started preparing for a far more public reckoning. This wasn't about punishment, it was about acknowledgement. The palace wasn't making an example of Prince Andrew. It was quietly admitting that his situation had become so toxic, so fraught, that expecting automatic loyalty from those around him was no longer realistic. The monarchy, long accused of protecting its own at any cost, had finally drawn a line, not with fanfare, but with quiet precision. The silence was deliberate, the distance unmistakable. For Andrew, the blow didn't come in shouts or headlines. It came in absence, in doors that no longer opened, in greetings that never came, in the steady erosion of everyday courtesy that had once defined his life. The humiliation wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Each missed gesture, each polite avoidance was its own quiet verdict. By the time this new rule took hold, his stay at Wood Farm no longer felt like a brief relocation. It felt like exile without ceremony, a demotion written not in documents, but in behavior. The man who once walked red carpets and commanded attention now moved through corridors where his presence caused discomfort. He wasn't feared or hated, he was simply avoided. How does a prince born into privilege end up trapped in silence instead of surrounded by ceremony? To understand that fall, you have to remember the rise. Prince Andrew Albert Christian Edward, born at Buckingham Palace on February 19, 1960, entered the world at the epicenter of royal tradition.
We've seen, haven't we, Patrick, in the last couple of days, that photograph of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor on all fours. And then his brother, Prince Edward, only 6-7 hours ago, was essentially kind of ambushed by a journalist and asked how he felt about the latest tranche of Epstein files, and says our thoughts are with the victims, perhaps showing the contrast between
The Queen's third child and her second son, his birth symbolized continuity, the next generation of Windsor strength. From day one, his life was scripted in expectation. His childhood wasn't ordinary. It was a training ground for monarchy. He grew up amid soldiers' salutes, formal processions, and a constant reminder that his life represented duty before choice. His role was clear: loyalty, service, and presence. Every ceremony reinforced belonging. Every tradition reminded him of permanence. As a young man, Andrew became the kind of royal the public wanted: confident, brave, and visible. His service as a Royal Navy helicopter pilot during the Falklands War in 1982 earned him admiration across Britain. He wasn't just a prince in uniform. He was on the front lines. For a brief moment, the image of action man Prince Andrew captured both respect and curiosity. That chapter elevated him. The palace showcased him as a symbol of modern courage, a royal who didn't just wave from balconies, but risked his life for country. Inside royal circles, his confidence was seen as charm. Outside, it was proof that the monarchy could adapt. Then came 1986, and with it, the glamour of his marriage to Sarah Ferguson. The wedding, held at Westminster Abbey, was celebrated as a fairy tale rebirth for the royal family, a modern royal love story broadcast to millions. For a short time, the public adored them. The images of laughter, affection, and normalcy softened the monarchy's rigid image. For Andrew, it was peak visibility: the applause, the cameras, the cheers. He was not just royal by blood, he was royal by relevance. His star seemed untouchable. But every rise in the monarchy carries its shadow. The same system that lifts its favorites can also erase them when scandal or scrutiny arrives. And Andrew's early promise, the daring prince, the charming husband, the Queen's dependable son, would soon collide with decisions and associations that no title could protect him from. The shift that began quietly at Wood Farm was decades in the making. What started in privilege was ending in isolation. The silence that surrounded him now wasn't accidental. It was earned. One headline, one choice, one vanished courtesy at a time. And as the walls of Sandringham closed in, the contrast became haunting. A man born into duty, now living on borrowed dignity. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because while Andrew faded from the public eye, what was happening inside the monarchy was far more revealing than his silence. The institution was evolving, and his absence had become part of its strategy. For a time, Prince Andrew seemed untouchable. Together with Sarah Ferguson, he became father to 2 daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, a family that cemented his image as a key pillar of royal life. Despite scandals, separations, and whispers, his place within the firm felt unshakable. He wasn't just in the monarchy, he was part of its core machinery. At one point, he was second in line to the throne. That fact alone defined his entire world: where he lived, who deferred to him, and how doors always opened before he even reached them. State dinners, overseas tours, official ceremonies. These weren't privileges, they were routine. Andrew met world leaders, shook hands with diplomats, and represented the crown abroad with confidence that bordered on certainty. The luxury, the protection, the automatic respect, it all flowed naturally. Even after his marriage ended, his status never truly wavered. He kept his titles, his properties, and his staff. Criticism came and went, but none of it ever stuck. The royal institution had always been a shield, absorbing shock, smoothing scandal, and protecting the image of the family. But that illusion of permanence, that sense that the system would always protect him, would one day shatter. Because now, years later, the contrast between then and now feels brutal. The man who once glided through rooms of gilded formality now walks through quiet corridors lined with discomfort. The staff that once bowed now avoid eye contact. The applause, the invitations, the air of authority, gone, as if erased from the script. His fall is so sharp precisely because his rise had been so complete. Andrew wasn't a marginal royal. He was central, visible, embedded, confident. His access wasn't symbolic. It was real. That's what makes his current isolation feel less like decline and more like collapse. In hindsight, the warning signs were obvious. Confidence became entitlement. Protection turned into expectation. The monarchy's invisible armor had made him untouchable. Or so he believed. Then came the association that would undo everything. For years, Andrew's connection to Jeffrey Epstein existed in a strange gray zone, known, discussed, yet never fully confronted. It hovered in the background, occasionally resurfacing in articles or documentaries, but it never caused real consequences. The palace managed it. The story stayed contained, until it didn't. The breaking point arrived in November 2019, when Andrew agreed to something no one in the royal machine could have prepared for. A televised interview that would become one of the biggest royal disasters of the century. It was meant to be damage control, a way to clear the air, to show confidence and transparency. But the BBC Newsnight broadcast didn't just fail, it exploded. Sitting stiffly under the studio lights, Andrew tried to explain away years of questionable judgment. His tone, his body language, his answers, all of it felt detached, defensive, and chillingly unaware of the gravity of his words. At one point, he said, 8 or 10 of us, I think, at the dinner. If there was a party, then I'd know nothing about that. The moment he said it, the damage was done. Viewers weren't watching a prince defending himself. They were watching a man crumble under the weight of his own detachment. What stood out wasn't the denials. It was what was missing. There was no remorse. No empathy for Epstein's victims. No understanding of how the scandal had shaken public faith in the monarchy. The silence in that studio was deafening. And by the next morning, headlines across the world said the same thing. The interview that ended a royal career. Commentators, journalists, and former palace staff all agreed it was catastrophic. What had been intended as a moment of clarity became a masterclass in self-destruction. The fallout was swift, cold, and absolute. Within days, his public duties were suspended, his patronages vanished, his once protected image imploded, and the monarchy, which had long absorbed the storm for him, finally did the unthinkable. It stepped back and let the consequences fall exactly where they belonged. The interview wasn't just a misstep. It was the moment a royal name became a public liability, and the start of a descent that would leave Andrew standing completely alone. When the cameras stopped rolling after that disastrous BBC Newsnight interview, Prince Andrew appeared detached, calm in a moment that demanded accountability. That eerie disconnection only made things worse. Within days, the walls began to close in. Buckingham Palace released a statement, careful, cold, and almost surgical in tone. The Duke of York will step back from public duties for the foreseeable future. Behind those cautious words lay an unmistakable truth. Andrew was finished as a working royal. Every public appearance, every patronage, every ceremonial role was suspended indefinitely. For the first time in his life, a prince had been formally removed from representation. The palace framed it as temporary, but everyone knew what it really meant. This was exile by another name. The interview had shifted Andrew's status from controversial to untenable. What had once been an internal crisis now became a global scandal. The monarchy, usually so skilled at absorbing turbulence, seemed stunned by the scale of the backlash. Attempts to contain the fire only made it spread faster. Each clarification deepened the outrage. Each silence invited new speculation. That interview wasn't just a PR disaster. It became the reference point, played, replayed, and dissected every time his name surfaced. The discussion was no longer about his association with Jeffrey Epstein. It was about judgment, accountability, and trust. Inside the palace, the damage was clear. Andrew's step back created a vacuum, one that stripped him of the structure, prestige, and insulation that had defined his entire adult life. Without official duties, his identity as a royal had no anchor. His image shifted from prince on pause to prince in disgrace. The most devastating part wasn't the loss of privilege. It was the missed chance to show empathy. In that one televised hour, he could have acknowledged pain, expressed regret, or recognized the human cost behind the headlines. Instead, he appeared emotionally absent, frozen in a moment that would haunt him for years. But behind the public fallout, something even more serious was forming. a quiet, legal reckoning. By early 2022, the story had left the tabloids and entered the courtroom. Andrew reached an out-of-court settlement with Virginia Giuffre, the woman whose allegations had shadowed him for nearly a decade. The agreement, finalized in February 2022, was deliberately vague. No admission of guilt, no detailed confession, just closure written in legal language. The exact financial amount was never confirmed, but reports from the Daily Telegraph estimated it could have reached £12 million. The palace presented it as an act of compassion and finality, a way to draw a line under the issue and move forward. But for the public, there was no closure, only questions. Who paid? What was admitted? What was avoided? The statement might have ended the case, but it didn't end the doubt. The monarchy's reputation had been scorched, and every attempt at calm only fueled a deeper unease. Then came April 2025, and tragedy. Virginia Giuffre, aged 41, was found dead by suicide on April 25th. The news sent shockwaves far beyond the royal bubble. Suddenly, the legal headlines gave way to something far more human: the unbearable cost of trauma and public exposure. Sympathy for her story deepened. The questions surrounding Andrew's role, his silence, and his decisions grew louder. For the monarchy, this was a turning point no PR team could manage. The issue was no longer about optics, it was about conscience. The legal closure had done nothing to erase the emotional devastation, and the moral weight of the case began to overshadow every remaining defense of Andrew's name. But the reckoning didn't stop there. In October 2025, Giuffre's posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl, was published. A haunting, unfiltered account of her life, her trauma, and the power dynamics that defined it. The book didn't unveil shocking new allegations, but it reframed everything through personal pain and lived truth. That changed everything again. Legal language became real emotion. Court documents became confession. Readers felt her story rather than studied it. And once again, Andrew's silence became the loudest sound in the room. The palace tried to hold the line, to keep the focus on moving forward. But behind the walls of Sandringham, the silence surrounding Andrew grew heavier by the day. His exile wasn't just physical anymore. It had become moral, emotional, and irreversible. Every royal knows the value of silence, but for Andrew, silence was no longer strategy. It was sentence. When Nobody's Girl hit the shelves, it was like striking a match in a room already filled with smoke. Overnight, excerpts from Virginia Giuffre's memoir flooded headlines, talk shows, and social media. Interviews with her friends, advocates, and even distant family members reignited the conversation that the palace had spent years trying to bury. For Prince Andrew, the timing couldn't have been worse. Whatever fragile hope he'd clung to, that the scandal might quietly fade, evaporated instantly. The book changed the tone entirely. Sympathy had shifted. This was no longer a story framed around scandal or defense. It was now a story of empathy for a survivor, and that shift left Andrew completely exposed. Inside Buckingham Palace, pressure tightened like never before. The silence that had once been strategy now looked like evasion. The monarchy could no longer hide behind patience. Every new interview, every discussion, every headline pressed the same question. How much longer could they stand by him? There was no single crisis to manage this time, no moment to contain. It was an accumulation of years, court cases, interviews, whispers, and rumors, all crashing together in a tidal wave of public fatigue and anger. Even within royal walls, people whispered that patience had finally run out. And then came the day that would rewrite royal history. October 30th, 2025, a date no one inside the monarchy will ever forget. That morning, without ceremony or preamble, King Charles III took the most drastic step the modern royal family had ever seen. Prince Andrew was officially stripped of all remaining titles. A short, sharply worded palace statement made it official. His Majesty the King has directed that, in light of ongoing circumstances, the Duke of York shall no longer hold any royal or military titles, nor shall he use styles of address associated with them. There was no ambiguity. Andrew was no longer a prince, no longer the Duke of York, no longer protected by the identities that had defined him since birth. The statement's tone was surgical, calm, legalistic, but final. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. The palace made clear that impact mattered more than intent. The controversy surrounding Andrew had reached a point where continued association was no longer sustainable. For context, the last time a British prince was stripped of his titles was over a century ago. That historical distance only emphasized how extraordinary this moment was. Within the monarchy, titles are more than decoration. They're currency. They determine access, rank, and respect. Removing them is the royal equivalent of disownment. But the blow didn't stop there. Alongside the loss of titles came the forfeiture of his lease at Royal Lodge. The property, a 30-room mansion set across nearly 100 acres in Windsor Great Park, had been his stronghold for over 2 decades. Originally secured in 2003, the deal had drawn public criticism for years, a sweetheart arrangement that let Andrew occupy a multi-million-pound estate for a minimal upfront payment and a symbolic peppercorn rent. Now, with no title and no role, there was no justification left to defend it. The palace revoked the lease quietly but decisively, citing the need to align property occupancy with active service to the crown. Translation: you don't work for the monarchy, you don't live on its land. From that moment, Andrew ceased to exist as a functioning royal. On paper, he became a private citizen. No duties, no patronages, no privileges, just a name without standing. Inside royal circles, he became someone to avoid rather than accommodate. Invitations disappeared. Conversations stopped. The quiet isolation that began at Wood Farm turned absolute. For the monarchy, this wasn't just a personal decision. It was a statement of survival. A clear signal to the world that the crown would now protect itself, not its members. For an institution often accused of moving too slowly, this was a seismic act of self-preservation. Public reaction mirrored the magnitude. Some called it justice long overdue. Others called it brutal, the monarchy turning its back on its own. But everyone agreed on one thing. There would be no comeback, no rehabilitation, no path back to grace. The door had been closed, and this time, the lock was permanent, or so it seemed, because even that closure didn't end the story. If anything, it made things worse. The loss of titles didn't silence the conversation, it amplified it. The press now had a new angle, the prince who lost his name. And just when the dust seemed ready to settle, another wave of scrutiny began to rise. On January 30th, 2026, came the moment the palace had feared most. A massive document release from US authorities investigating the Giuffre Epstein network. Millions of pages, thousands of images, and hours of video evidence were made public. The files didn't just reopen wounds, they promised a reckoning no royal advisor could contain. And as the world began digging through that mountain of evidence, one question echoed louder than ever. What else was hidden in the shadows of Andrew's past? The release landed like an earthquake. Millions of pages, thousands of images, hours of unseen footage tied to the long-running US investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's network. The January 30th, 2026 document drop was more than just a headline. It was a global shockwave that ripped through governments, institutions, and royal walls alike. But buried within that massive archive were details that immediately reignited scrutiny around Prince Andrew. As journalists and investigators began combing through the files, familiar names, dates, and locations reappeared. Reporters spotted references that made the world pause, emails stretching back more than a decade, exchanged between Epstein and an unnamed royal contact referred to simply as the Duke. The contents were ambiguous but damning enough to raise fresh questions. The emails mentioned introductions, private dinners, and guest stays, phrasing that sparked instant speculation about Royal Lodge, Andrew's longtime residence at Windsor Great Park. Then came the most damaging revelation yet, claims that some encounters had allegedly taken place inside Royal Lodge itself. For the monarchy, the symbolism was devastating. This wasn't just about scandal anymore. It was about geography. A royal home, once defended as sacred private space, had now been dragged into an international criminal narrative. Within days, British authorities confirmed they were reviewing the material. Their statement was deliberately measured, but its meaning was unmistakable. This was not being dismissed. The mention of active assessment was enough to suggest that, for the first time, the Crown's walls were no longer immune to outside investigation. The idea that Epstein-linked activities might be associated with a royal residence turned public frustration into outrage. The palace, which had spent years trying to contain the fire, suddenly found the flames leaping its walls. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, U.S. officials added fuel to the crisis. A spokesperson for the Department of Justice publicly commented that Prince Andrew should be prepared to cooperate if asked to clarify details emerging from the files. There was no formal legal mechanism to compel him, but the implication was sharp. The expectation of silence was over. The crisis had crossed borders. What had once been dismissed as rumor now sat inside an official archive, stamped and authenticated. The distance that once protected Andrew, the ocean, the titles, the diplomatic niceties, evaporated overnight. Inside the monarchy, the tension was unbearable. The timing was catastrophic. Andrew had only just been stripped of his titles and expelled from Royal Lodge a few months earlier. Palace advisors had hoped that those actions would close the chapter, that the public finally might move on. Instead, the files reopened everything. And worse, they reframed the narrative entirely. What had once been spun as decisive accountability now looked like damage control executed just in time to preempt something bigger. The public saw not resolve, but reaction. The monarchy's timing now seemed less like moral leadership and more like a desperate shield against what they knew was coming. Political pressure began to mount. Parliament members called for transparency. American talk shows dissected every new headline. Even royal loyalists struggled to defend the institution's handling of Andrew's downfall. The sense of patience, both inside and outside royal walls, evaporated completely. For many, the release of the files confirmed what had long been whispered, that the crown had known more than it admitted, and that silence had always been less about discretion and more about protection. Public reaction was fierce. Protesters gathered outside royal landmarks demanding accountability. Headlines screamed "Royal Residence in Epstein Files," while social media exploded with speculation, timelines, and archived photographs. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. The monarchy's attempts at distance had failed. The shadow they tried to contain had followed them home. The Epstein files didn't just reawaken old scandals. They stripped away the illusion of closure. They made it clear that the story wasn't finished. It had only entered a new, more dangerous phase. Because now, for the first time in modern royal history, a scandal once thought buried was poised to pull the institution itself into the storm. And as investigators continued to sift through the evidence, one question grew louder in every headline, every interview, every whispered conversation in Westminster and Windsor alike. If this is what the world has seen, what else remains unseen? The scale of the Epstein document release was staggering. Millions of pages, thousands of files, and enough evidence to reignite every conversation the palace wanted buried. Even before conclusions were drawn, the sheer volume of information fueled suspicion. Every headline, every snippet, every mention of the Duke turned up the pressure, not only on Prince Andrew, but on the monarchy itself. Inside royal circles, the contrast became painfully clear. While Andrew's name once again dominated the global press, the rest of the family had already shifted into survival mode. Senior working royals, Prince William, Princess Catherine, even Prince Edward, responded with measured caution, emphasizing empathy for victims and restraint in tone. Their public comments were brief, deliberate, and heavy with subtext. Silence from Andrew felt like guilt. Statements from others sounded like leadership. The difference wasn't lost on anyone. One brief moment captured the entire divide. When asked about the latest revelations, Prince Edward offered a short but powerful response. "Our thoughts are with the victims. It's important to remember who they are, the victims in all this." Just 14 words, but they carried the weight of the institution. It was a royal acknowledgement without directly naming Andrew, a subtle reminder that the family was moving on without him. For Andrew, those files represented more than accusation. They represented permanence. Digital archives don't disappear. Public memory doesn't fade. Screenshots, transcripts, and references ensured that his story would always be accessible, not in dusty archives, but in search engines. Rehabilitation wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. By the end of January 2026, one truth had become undeniable. The files hadn't just reopened old wounds, they had rewritten the entire conversation. The focus was no longer on how the monarchy had distanced itself, but on what it still hadn't answered. Every quiet step away from Andrew only raised new questions about what had been tolerated for so long. And so, as Andrew crossed back into Wood Farm, the question that lingered over the kingdom was hauntingly simple. Was this finally the end of his story, or the beginning of something even darker?